Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is John Phelan. I'm DJ here at ICMP. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Maybe Johnny Lappin, Patrick Mortier, can you hear me okay? Thumbs up if the audio is working. Super, great stuff. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, ICMP members, for joining today. A warm welcome from Brussels here, from the office headquarters, with all the staff on site here for today's event. And also a very warm welcome to some guests that we have from the European Commission, from WIPO, and indeed from other colleague organisations around the music industry for today's event. What we're going to do is we're obviously going to delve a little bit into the flagship piece of European legislation called the EU Digital Services Act. We're going to talk a little bit about why it has come about, what's in it, how ICMP played a role in that gestation process, and most importantly of all, what does it mean for the music sector, the music publishing industry, and what will it do for it? So we've put together a presentation for today, which really hopefully spans between the legalities and all of the weeds and details there for everyone who's working in that side of the industry, but also something which is a little bit more bigger picture, looking at, as I say, the political reasons why this big piece of legislation was brought in, because it is indeed an issue far bigger than copyright. So Pietro, if you could kindly bring up our slides, we'll kick off with these visual materials which we've put together. These visual materials don't get the frights now when we mention PowerPoint. Hopefully this will be a very simple walk through the legislation and will really help the understanding. We've put some great work into that, so I do hope that they will work effectively. David's on our chat box today as well too, as is Jenny. So in terms of questions, what I would say is ask them at any time, put them into the chat box. David and Jenny will gather those. And at the end of the event, what we'll do is we'll sweep those all up and answer them directly. We'll actually technically be able to unmute your microphone, of course, so you can ask your question with your microphone verbally to our team here. And if not, then David will have the questions in text and he'll just ask us, and Yura and I will answer as best we can. So keep the questions coming, keep chatting away in the chat box, and the team will take care of that once we've finished the presentation. So Pietro, let's kick off with the PowerPoint, please. Thank you very much. I hope you can see that clearly. There we go. Okay, so just a little bit of a short introduction to the music publishing industry for those who are guests today. ICMP is the global trade body for the music publishing industry. And of course, music publishers are involved at every point of music usage, whether that is live, physical sales, TV, broadcast, radio, film, NFTs, gaming, print, you name it. Music publishers are involved. And so they're that nexus point between music markets and the industry. But of course, digital is very much today dominant, and that's why pieces of legislation such as the Digital Services Act are crucially important. And that's what we're going to talk about in detail today. First of all, I also want to thank very much the team here for putting together today's presentation. They've been beavering away so hard over the last few days to put this together, and I just want to thank each one of them in person: Pietro Villani, David O'Cana-Paramo, Jenny McLeod-Agray, and Yura Kralj. I also want to particularly thank Natalie Felt, Managing Director at Felt Music, for the fantastic music, which she has licensed to us for the waiting room. And thanks very much indeed to you, Natalie, and to your team at Felt Music. So today's event is the latest in our digital series. We've covered lots of previous topics before: safe harbor, artificial intelligence, NFTs, you name it. We've covered all of those topics, and we hope this has been useful for members. We'll continue to do it on topics coming up in the near future. So the DSA, obviously European legislation is a complex beast at the best of times. What happens essentially is that laws are put together by the co-negotiators of the European Parliament, the European Commission, and the European Council, which represents the 27 national member governments. So that European legislation governs the entire European single market, and we're going to go into the DSA in great detail as to what it does. But essentially, that negotiation process happens between the three institutions. ICMP plugs into each of those institutions. If you take the European Parliament alone, that's currently 701 MEPs from across 12 political groups. That's a huge lobby challenge, never mind in the 27 governments in the Council with all of their political perspectives, and the European Commission as well too. This legislation is really to build upon the digital policy such as the Copyright Directive, and really focuses in terms of the entire digital market. But for our industry, the most relevant are, of course, Google, Meta, eBay, Apple, app stores, Amazon, etc. All of these are applicable to the DSA, and we'll be talking about how in just a moment. DSA has just recently concluded its negotiations in November 2022, and will actually be entering into force in just a few matter of weeks. And so that's why today's event is timely. Why did it come about? Well, if we look at the European Commission, in all of the laws that it makes, whether across all different sectors, in all of the different areas that it makes laws, there's only one enforcement possibility for the Commission normally, and that's in the area of competition law or antitrust, and the ability for the Commission to enforce its own law via cases to the Court of Justice of the European Union. And what we've seen historically over the last 10, 11 years is, of course, a series of very high-profile big cases where the Commission has brought these cases against some large tech companies for breaches or alleged breaches of competition law in Europe, or indeed of antitrust. And as you can see here, some of the biggest judgments in the Court of Justice have included recently Google's case, where they had an injunction placed against it of more than €4 billion for breaching European competition law. Similarly, Microsoft famously breached a European competition law also. It had an almost €500 million fine some 9 years ago. And as you can see here, what the Commission and the EU is trying to do is say that dominant companies such as Google and Microsoft and these big players have a special responsibility to ensure that the way they do business doesn't prevent competition and doesn't harm consumers and innovation. So that's really the premise of the competition law concept. But of course, going to court, never mind securing these big fines, not only is it very laborious, but it can often be inefficient for actually preventing problems, of course, because you're going to court to chase solutions to problems, you're not preventing them. So that's not exactly the best way of going about things, despite these large fines. And actually, if you're on the end of these big fines and you're Microsoft, Google, Facebook, etc., the cost of doing business, frankly, 4 billion really doesn't scratch the surface, frankly. So far better to actually have good laws in the first place, which are more robust. And as you've seen in recent months in Europe and indeed in the US, legislators have been emboldened by the Copyright Directive and Article 17 to take more legislation and put more legislation in place in terms of how the digital marketplace functions, competition law, and indeed the liabilities of these big companies which often don't respect the laws which are already in place. So what the Commission politically is trying to do here is get away from this kind of case law approach and going to the court, and more towards boosting and beefing up its own piece of law framework, which affects, of course, our entire industry. So what's the big picture really post DSA currently? Well, it's really quite remarkable. Some of the largest companies, if they breach the legislation that's just been passed, can be fined by the European Commission, and that can be implemented in court. And those fines can range up to 6% of global annual turnover at the end of a closed year financial year. For Google, Apple, Twitter, Microsoft, and Meta in particular, that's a reasonably big stick to be waving for the European Commission. And that is some of the new enforcement aspects which is available under this legislation. If there are further breaches of the DSA through some of the reporting and enforcement sections, which Yuri will talk about in a moment, a company which doesn't respect the judgments or rulings can, even to the end of these sanctions, can be expelled from the European Union single market from operations. So again, another huge stick to be waving. And this is making big news at the moment. So you'll be seeing in high-profile newspapers that big tech is really to face this new rulebook. What we're going to talk about today is how that applies to music. You'll see lots of articles in the coming weeks as this comes into force about the EU and US and how it's turning up the heat on Twitter and Apple, etc. And indeed, Elon Musk has been recently meeting with Commissioner Thierry Breton. Thierry Breton, of course, being the European Commissioner for the Internal Market, who was responsible for proposing this legislation from the European Commission. I think we can actually hear what they
Of course, we discussed many issues, and I was happy to be able to explain to you the DSA, yes, a new regulation in Europe. And I think that now you understand very well. It fits pretty well with what you think we should do on a platform.
No, I think it's exactly aligned with my thinking. I think I very much agree with, it's been a great discussion. And I really think, I agree with everything you said, really.
So there we go. We have it on record. Elon Musk agrees with everything that Thierry Breton said about the DSA, which is good news. Just remember to take a license, Elon, next time. We'll talk about that in a little bit more serious detail in a moment, but this gives you a sense of the profile for the legislation. So why does it matter for music? Well, like all legislation, it's tremendously important because it affects all of our ICMP members operating in Europe. So if you're an American, an Argentinian, an Australian, a Japanese company, and you have operations in Europe, you will be affected by this legislation and your business will be affected. Therefore, the boosts that it gives, and obviously the challenges that it gives, are directly relevant to your company. Secondly, and most importantly, publishers are the first partner of composers and songwriters around the world. They are responsible for supporting the rights of composers and songwriters. That's what they do day in and day out. And so this legislation brings boosts to all of the partners of music publishers, the songwriters and composers, by boosting their rights and giving them stronger ability to enforce their copyright. So what's this leading to? It's leading to a very changed ecosystem for the digital music market globally. If you can see some key figures here, let's look at 2001. The global value of music copyright was in and around 28 billion US dollars. Today, as of end year 2021, we're now just south of 40 billion US dollars. And what we're seeing as well too last year is a plus 18% growth rate year on year for the value of copyright. Really extraordinary figures. And if you look also in terms of the streamed video on demand markets, SVOD markets, such as YouTube and Facebook, today that's 58% of all traffic online. So that goes to show the importance of having good laws affecting those. In terms of the music publishing sector, as of end year 2021, now just looking at 13.5 billion US dollars. And again, that growth which is coming year on year due to more robust copyright situation and legislation. How's ICMP played a role? Well, just very briefly, I mentioned how complex that challenge is amongst the three different institutions, Commission, Parliament and Council. But ICMP, and through its global board, through its legal expert group, through all of the staff, have put in a 300-page submission to the European Commission, of course, at the very start of the process, and then taken that as a basis to work all the way through the Council and Parliament. Very high-profile political works, because these are big companies, high-profile, and people are discussing about freedom of expression, content moderation. So it's been a very delicate political process for ICMP to be involved in. One very great resolution in the end was that, to give you an insight as to how those negotiations work, Google was very close to securing a safe harbor for the search division part of its operations in the final negotiations, and that wording. And I'm pleased to say that that wording was removed in the final days of the negotiations. And so that's very good news for music publishers and indeed, of course, for the broader music sector. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and this goes to show some of the sense of what we're up against. In 2022, the tech sector in Brussels alone spent just under 100 million euro, and that's only the funds that we know about, the direct funding. So that gives you a sense of some of what we're up against. Many of our members and of course some of our guests today will be familiar with the data that we've released about the Copyright Directive and how that lobby took place. 8 million emails to the European Parliament, 57 million pounds spent by big tech. And you can see here on the left some of the highest profile think tanks and NGOs in Brussels who take indirect funding as well too from the tech sector to often counter copyright and the Digital Services Act in our positions. So that gives you some sense of what we're up against. Again, this is making big news stateside in Europe. You can see the sheer size of the lobby organizations in the top left, the amount of hires that are going on at these big companies in GAFAM. And on the right-hand side, some of, thankfully, the media now starting to cover the degree of influence in which these big companies are having in terms of Brussels legislation. As you can see the quote, "We have never seen this kind of money spent this way." Okay, one sort of big thing to remember about the DSA is it's a package of laws. So this new EU digital rulebook is actually one piece of legislation on one side of the DSA. Complementing that, it's the Digital Markets Act. That's really dealing with competition law, the scale and scope and size of these companies, etc. We're not going to talk about that today because that's not directly relevant to our industry. Of course, all of our members have received detailed briefings on this, but what we're going to focus really today is the second piece of legislation, the Digital Services Act, which really enforces the DMA. And as you can see here from these slides, the DSA brings in a whole series of conditions and obligations and bans alongside the DMA. So what we've decided to do at ICMP is we've brought the guide, basically gathered a guide, let's say, to the Digital Services Act. We've gathered this in two sections. We've broken it down, basically what's in it, what does it do, and the second section gathers the articles together into themes for music publishers to really make it easy to navigate. So that's what we're going to delve into. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Jura Kralj, who's the Legal and Policy Executive, of course, here at ICMP, who many of our members know, but for our guests. And Jura has been working very closely alongside the team here on the DSA, and he's going to walk you through the rest. So make sure to gather your questions, pop them in the chat box, and we'll take it at the very end. Thanks very much for now. Jura, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from my side as well. And welcome to this edition of ICMP's Digital Series dedicated to the Digital Services Act. My name is Jura, and I'll be your guide to the DSA today. Now, the DSA being a complex piece of legislation, we wanted to make sure we present it in a clear and intelligible way, which is why we propose to approach this presentation from two angles. The first, as John mentioned, consists in an overview of simple questions you may have been asking yourselves in relation to the Digital Services Act. The second angle from which we propose to approach the DSA today will be by examining the different themes dealt with by the DSA, which will allow us to focus on those aspects most relevant to our industry. Now, this brings us to an important caveat. In preparing this presentation, we tailored its content to the interests of the music publishing industry. Now, while it's based on a robust legal understanding of the regulation, this presentation will therefore omit certain aspects not deemed to be very important to the participants in this room. For those legal professionals among you who might need a global and in-depth overview of the DSA, however, not to worry, as we will continue to provide in-depth analysis, mapping, covering all aspects. You can expect the next package of supporting documents in the weeks following this event. Before we get started, just the usual housekeeping information. Please mute your microphones and keep them muted for the duration of the presentation. A chat box is available for general communication with our team regarding any technical matters, as well as for sharing your most pressing questions in the chat box, which we'll do our very best to answer at the end of the presentation. Those asking questions will also be given the opportunity to ask them verbally. So please keep an ear out for your name and unmute yourself in the Q&A session so that the others may hear your question as well. With the housekeeping rules taken care of, I propose we delve right into the topic of today's event, namely the Digital Services Act. A good starting point, we thought, would be to first determine what the DSA actually is. You might hear the DSA referred to in a number of ways, including as an act, a new rulebook, part of EU's flagship digital package. But it's important to note that at its foundation, the Digital Services Act is an EU regulation. This entails a number of important consequences, namely, it is directly applicable, meaning there's no need for transposition and hence no variation in the national rules. The DSA is a single rulebook for the entire single market. An EU regulation also has direct effect, meaning that individuals and entities can rely on its provisions directly, including in a court of law. Finally, an EU regulation is legally binding, not only on the entities that fall under its scope, but also on the EU member states and institutions. Before we delve deep into the contents of the DSA, we felt it appropriate to share with you a short glossary outlining some of the abbreviations we might encounter. This will also be shared in the chat box by our colleague David, but I propose to walk you through these abbreviations very quickly before we get started. The DSA will obviously refer to the Digital Services Act, the DMA to its twin regulation, the Digital Markets Act. GDPR, some of you may know from other areas, and it stands for General Data Protection Regulation. ISPs refers to providers of intermediary services. VLOPs and VLOSes are abbreviations we'll be encountering quite a lot, and they stand for very large online platforms and very large online search engines, respectively. DSCs refer to Digital Services Coordinators, National Competent Authorities for Implementation and Enforcement, as we'll discuss later on. MAUs are Monthly Active Users. UUC is User Uploaded Content. EC is the European Commission, and NCAs are National Competent Authorities. Having determined that the DSA is indeed an EU regulation with all of the implications that that entails, let's move ahead and answer the next question in our overview. What does the DSA do? There's two aspects to consider in this context, one related to substance and the other to process. Substantively, the DSA lays down EU-wide directly applicable rules for digital services operating in the EU. This last point is of critical importance. The DSA doesn't only regulate entities established in the European Union, but all those entities offering services to recipients located in the Union. In this sense, all providers under the scope, whether established in Brussels, Belgium, or Brussels, Wisconsin, will be required to ensure that the services offered to recipients in the European Union comply with the DSA's provisions on proportionate due diligence, transparency, and targeted prohibitions. These provisions represent the substantive rules included in the DSA. The second angle, as mentioned previously, has to do with procedure. In this sense, the DSA lays down rules on the supervision and enforcement, be it by national authorities or the European Commission. These outline the various powers authorities will dispose of when enforcing the regulation. I hope the audio is okay. I'm hearing that perhaps we might have an audio problem. Audio is back. Excellent. Thank you very much for the feedback. Moving swiftly on, I next propose we have a look at how the Digital Services Act regulates providers of digital services in the EU. The answer to this question, in essence, is threefold. First, the Digital Services Act introduces proportionate due diligence, transparency, and governance obligations on providers of intermediary services, tailored to the size and type of a given service provider. We will come back to examine these in more detail later in the presentation. Second, the Digital Services Act introduces targeted and limited prohibitions, including the ban on dark patterns, as well as the ban on targeted advertising for minors. More to follow on this as well. Finally, the DSA lays down, as mentioned, the institutional and procedural framework for the supervision and enforcement of its provisions, equipping the competent authorities with the powers necessary to ensure compliance. Now, the question that appears to us just as important as knowing what the DSA does is knowing what the DSA does not do. While the impacts of the Digital Services Act are numerous, certain rules and practices aren't affected and needn't be modified. One such example is substantive copyright rules in the EU. As stated clearly in Article 2 on the scope, the Digital Services Act is without prejudice to Union legislation on copyright, which will therefore continue to apply. For instance, the DSM directive that is yet to be transposed by a number of member states will therefore continue to apply fully, as will other sectoral legislation in this area. Another thing the DSA does not do is expand liability exemptions or safe harbors for providers of intermediary services. The provisions it contains on this topic are essentially a transplant of the same provisions in the 2000 e-commerce directive, which is also a testament to the quality of the legislation adopted at the time, that it withstood 2 decades of technical innovation to be re-included in essentially the same form in a new piece of cutting-edge legislation. As John has mentioned, one aspect of the rules that was hotly contested during negotiations was the implementation of a safe harbor for online search engines. Thanks in part to a coordinated advocacy effort by trade bodies, including ICMP, the Digital Services Act does not include such a safe harbor, and online search engines are subject to the same rules as other providers of intermediary services. Now, one question that will certainly be pressing for colleagues in the room is, given the numerous provisions on content moderation, notice and action, and similar aspects of the DSA, are we required to modify our approach to existing enforcement practices? Happily, the answer to that question is negative. The DSA does not require you to modify your approach. It does, however, present certain opportunities to streamline your efforts, which we'll discuss in more details in just another minute. Finally, does the DSA prohibit the use of automated content recognition? Unhelpfully, the Digital Services Act is confusing in this regard, in particular in relation to what's commonly referred to as a ban on general monitoring. Now, to make things perfectly clear, This does not relate to the use of automated content recognition, which remains permitted under the new rules. Rather, the so-called ban on general monitoring relates to the prohibition of imposing a general monitoring obligation on providers of intermediary services, either by member states or EU institutions. The voluntary adoption of ACR, therefore, remains permitted. These are just some of the key considerations to keep in mind when evaluating the relative importance of the DSA to the music publishing industry. Now, which obligations does it impose? With this, we have arrived at the very core of the Digital Services Act, namely the obligations it imposes on the providers of intermediary services. These obligations are contained in Chapter 3 of the regulation and are split into 5 categories of providers. First, a general set of obligations is applicable to all the providers of intermediary services. A second set of obligations is applicable to providers of hosting services in addition to the first. A third set of obligations applies in addition to the first and the second to providers of online platforms. Online marketplaces have additional obligations outlined in Section 4. And finally, very large online platforms and very large online search engines are subject to the broadest list of obligations under DSA. Let's now have a closer look at the breakdown of these obligations. What we've prepared here is a table that we use quite often in our work when we examine the obligations applicable to a given provider, and I propose we take just a minute to break down what you're seeing on the screen. First, the location of what we're seeing. These obligations are contained in the Digital Services Act, Chapter 3. This chapter is further subdivided into Sections 1 through 5, each outlining the obligations applicable to a given category of providers. As we've mentioned, all the providers of intermediary services are subject to a baseline set of obligations. Providers of hosting services have additional obligations applicable cumulatively to the first. Online platforms need to comply with Sections 1 through 3. Providers of online marketplaces have additional obligations outlined in Section 4, while providers of very large online platforms and very large online search engines are subject to the full suite of obligations under the DSA, with the possible exception of provisions applicable to online marketplaces to the extent that they do not offer such services. I propose we now quickly have a look at each of these categories to outline the obligations that apply to these providers, which will examine some of them in greater detail later on, but not at this stage just yet. Obligations applicable to all the providers of intermediary services include the obligation to designate contact points for communication with authorities on the one hand and service recipients on the other, as well as an obligation to designate legal representatives. You may recall we mentioned that the DSA doesn't only regulate entities established in the EU, but all of those offering services to recipients located in the EU. In the event that such a provider would not be established in the Union, they are required to designate a legal representative, which crucially can be held liable for infringements of the DSA by this provider it represents. All providers of intermediary services are also required to provide information on restrictions in their terms and conditions, and are subject to an annual transparency reporting obligation that will break down in greater detail later in the presentation. In addition to the foregoing, providers of hosting services have additional obligations to ensure a compliant notice and action mechanism, to provide a statement of reasons to users affected by restrictions, as well as to notify suspicions of criminal offenses involving a threat to the life or safety of persons. Providers of online platforms have additional obligations on top of what we've just mentioned, which include the obligation to provide an internal complaint handling system, to enable out-of-court dispute settlement, to ensure priority treatment for trusted flaggers. Now, this is one of those opportunities to streamline your efforts that we'll come back to later in the presentation. They must also establish measures against misuse. They are subject to a broader transparency reporting obligation. They must establish a compliant interface design and organization. This is where the so-called ban on dark patterns is included, which we'll also discuss later. They must ensure advertising transparency as well as recommender system transparency. And finally, they must ensure the online protection of minors. The fourth category of providers are providers of online marketplaces. These are defined in the DSA as online platforms allowing consumers to conclude distance contracts with third-party traders. These are required in addition to the foregoing to ensure the traceability of traders, something that is shown to be a problem in previous times. We'll examine the content of this obligation in greater detail further down the line. They must also ensure compliance by design, as well as to inform recipients of infringing content on their marketplaces. Finally, the providers of very large online platforms and very large online search engines are subject to all of the foregoing obligations, as well as to the following ones. They are required to conduct annual risk assessments for systemic risks. This is of key importance, and we'll discuss this in greater detail as well as to establish mitigation measures for those systemic risks they've identified. They must comply with a crisis response mechanism, which, while a very interesting part of the DSA, isn't necessarily relevant to our examination today. They're required to ensure annual independent audits, to provide an alternative recommender system. They are subject to additional advertising transparency obligations, must comply with requests for data access and scrutiny, must establish a DSA compliance function. They are subject to the broadest transparency reporting obligation twice annually and must pay an annual supervisory fee to the Commission. This is an outline of all of these obligations, a very useful table. We recommend that you refer to it in your work if you find it useful as well. These are all of the obligations to which providers of intermediary services are subject to under the Digital Services Act. Now, before we delve deeper into the substance of these obligations, a quick look at the procedural next steps. The DSA has been proposed, negotiated, adopted, and has since been published on the 16th of November, 2022. The rules have also entered into force 20 days following the publication and will have a phased start of application. Now, what this means is certain obligations will kick in under a month, and certain others will take over a year to begin to apply. On the 17th of February of this year, platforms and search engines will be required to publish their average user numbers. This will enable the Commission to designate those platforms that have 45 million average monthly active users or more as very large online platforms or very large online search engines, which will then be required to comply with the full suite of obligations as of 4 months following their designation. For other entities under the scope, the DSA will begin to apply as of the 17th of February of next year, which is also the deadline by which member states are required to set up national competent authorities and designate their digital services coordinators. A quick look at the structure of the regulation itself. Being an element of secondary EU law, the operative provisions or the articles are preceded by recitals. These are non-binding texts, introductory statements, if you will, that are nevertheless useful in elucidating the exact intention of the legislator, be it when implementing or perhaps litigating these provisions down the line. These recitals are followed by the general provisions in Chapter 1. These include articles on the subject matter, scope, as well as definitions. Very important for the understanding of this regulation, less so for our presentation today. Chapter 2 deals with the liability of providers of intermediary services, or safe harbors, to put it plainly. As we've mentioned previously, the scope and substance of these did not change. They're essentially transplanted from 2000 e-commerce directive, and we propose to leave it at that for the purpose of this presentation. Chapter 3, we've just examined. It contains the 5 categories of obligations applicable to the different categories of providers, while Chapter 4 deals with the implementation, cooperation, penalties, and enforcement, so to speak, the teeth of the regulation. There is a 5th chapter dealing with modifications to other pieces of EU law, but again, not immediately relevant to our work here today, so we propose to omit it for the purposes of this presentation. This now brings us to the second angle from which we propose to tackle this topic today, namely from the angle of topics dealt with under the DSA. We might not examine all of these during today's presentation, but you'll certainly be able to consult them when you receive these slides later on following our event. One very important aspect of the DSA are transparency obligations. As mentioned, these are tailored to different categories of providers. We will first examine transparency reporting obligations, but also spend some time on advertising transparency. Starting with transparency reporting, there are 3 tiers of obligations related to transparency reporting under the DSA. A first set, included in Article 15, applies to all the providers of intermediary services. These obligations are contained in Article 15, provided for your information here with some useful highlights, but in order to keep things very clear, also broken out in very clear content. Now, under Article 15, all the providers of intermediary services are required to report annually regarding their compliance with the provisions of the DSA on orders to act against illegal content and orders to provide information. These are orders by member state authorities, as well as on notice and action mechanism, content moderation policies, internal complaint handling systems, as well as any use made of automated means for content moderation. The exact information to be reported will include, for instance, the number of notices received, the actions taken pursuant to the notices, as well as the processing of notices by using automated means, as well as the median time needed to take action. This is just an example of the scale of the information that will be reported. And a very important precision here, this will not be reported to any enforcement authority, national or EU, but will rather be made public for all to see. Online platforms will, in addition to what we've just described, be required to include in their reporting additional information related to the number of disputes submitted to out-of-court dispute settlement, as well as the number of suspensions pursuant to Article 23, which deals with measures for protection against misuse. For example, when somebody uploads manifestly infringing content very frequently, or on the other side, when somebody submits manifestly unfounded notices very frequently. In addition to this, providers will be required to publish their average monthly active user figures and will be required to submit to the Commission any internal complaint decisions as well as statements of reasons. These will be included in an online database that will also be made available to the public. Finally, very large online platforms and very large online search engines will be subject to the broadest transparency reporting obligations under the DSA. They will be required to comply with Articles 15 and 24 that we've just seen, excuse me, but they will be required to report twice annually in accordance with those provisions, as well as on any human resources that are dedicated to content moderation, the qualifications, competences, and training for these resources, the indicators of accuracy employed, as well as the information on the average monthly recipients of the service disaggregated by member state. They're also required to report to competent authorities on a number of due diligence and governance provisions related to risk assessment, mitigation, and audits. Finally, a word on advertising transparency. There are two levels of obligations related to advertising transparency. One that applies to advertising on online platforms. In accordance with Article 26, providers of online platforms will be required to ensure that those who receive the service recipients can identify in a clear, concise, and unambiguous manner and in real time that the information presented to them is an advertisement, on whose behalf the advertisement is being presented, who paid for the advertisement, as well as any meaningful parameters that have been used to target this individual with this advertisement, alongside with options to change those parameters. The obligations of very large online platforms and very large online search engines for advertising transparency do not include a much broader list of content. However, they must be included in what is essentially an online database, along with a reliable tool allowing for multi-criteria queries, and all of this information needs to be maintained in this database until 1 year has passed since the advertisement was presented for the last time. Moving swiftly on, we've already mentioned liability exemptions and safe harbors, and we've clarified that their scope and substance does not change. You're welcome to examine these provisions when you receive these slides following our event. A quick word on bans. There are, in essence, three key prohibitions under the DSA. One is the so-called ban on general monitoring. We've already clarified this does not relate to automated content recognition. It relates to the prohibition of imposing a general monitoring obligation on providers by EU institutions or member states. It does not impact the use of ACR tech. Second prohibition under the DSA is the prohibition of so-called dark patterns. It sounds very mystical. We'll demystify it very quickly. Basically, this prohibition is a prohibition of designing or organizing an online interface in a way that would deceive or manipulate the recipient of the service in a way that would materially distort or impair their ability to make free and informed decisions. This is commonly referred to as a ban on dark patterns, but it's certainly less mystifying when broken out this way. Finally, the ban on targeted ads for minors. Very quickly, advertisements based on profiling targeted at minors are prohibited on online platforms. Perhaps a very quick look at content moderation provisions. These will be key for the work of many of our guests today on the line, starting with notice and action mechanisms under Article 16. You can see a screenshot of Article 16 on your screens now, and there are many, many highlights, so we've kindly broken them out into more intelligible points. Providers are required to establish user-friendly mechanisms to allow individuals to notify the presence of illegal content. They must provide a confirmation of receipt and need to take decisions in a timely, diligent, non-arbitrary, and objective manner. In essence, there is nothing that would impose any changes to your current practices under this provision. So you may continue to provide notices as you have been doing until this point. A statement of reasons must be provided to service recipients affected by restrictions, not necessarily key for our examination, but what is key is the status of trusted flaggers outlined in Article 22. This is what I referred to when I mentioned the possibility of streamlining your notice and action efforts. Again, a very lengthy provision, many highlights, but in essence, this is what it contains. Notices submitted by those with the status of trusted flaggers will be granted priority treatment and will be decided upon without delay. This status is awarded by the Digital Services Coordinator, so the national competent authority of your member state, upon application to an applicant that fulfills the relevant conditions. These include particular expertise and competence in detecting, identifying, and notifying illegal content, independence from providers of platforms, as well as the fact that the trusted flagger conducts its activities in a timely, diligent, and objective manner. So on the one hand, priority treatment and decision without undue delay, but on the other hand, the trusted flaggers will be subject to an annual reporting obligation to the Digital Services Coordinator that has awarded them the status. Finally, the provisions against misuse, very simple measures in place to sanction either those users who frequently upload manifestly infringing and illegal content. These will be suspended for a reasonable period after a prior warning, and the same will happen for those who frequently provide notices and complaints which are manifestly unfounded, which again will be suspended, or rather the processing of their notices and complaints will be suspended once more for a reasonable period following a prior warning. This brings us back to the menu of topics, perhaps a quick look at the due diligence provisions. Of course, we've mentioned that all providers are required to designate contact points for authorities, for recipients. They are required to designate legal representatives, as well as to disclose any restrictions on use in their terms and conditions. No need to go through that once more. What is crucial is Article 34 on risk assessments. This is a provision that applies to providers of very large online platforms and very large online search engines, and requires them to conduct annual risk assessments to identify systemic risks stemming from the use, design, functioning of their service, again, on an annual basis. If we look at Article 34 a little closer, you will see that the indicative list of systemic risks already includes the dissemination of illegal content, most welcome, as well as any actual or foreseeable negative effects for the exercise of fundamental rights. You might check the entire indicative list of these fundamental rights to find the right to private property. You won't find it, but that doesn't mean that it's not included in the risk assessments. Once the risk assessment is done, the provider is also required to implement appropriate measures to mitigate these systemic risks. And these can range, it's a broad range of measures that can be taken, linked to the design, terms and conditions, content moderation processes, algorithmic systems, internal processes, but crucially, under point G, One of the measures can include initiating or adjusting their cooperation with trusted flaggers, another one of the attributes of that status, should you choose to pursue it. The topic of complaints essentially deals with the internal complaint handling system, as well as the out-of-court dispute settlement. Again, something you're kindly invited to examine when you receive these slides, but I propose we quickly move to the topic of marketplaces. Now, these are subject to additional obligations that might prove very useful, in particular as they relate to the traceability of traders. Under Article 30, providers of intermediary services, and indeed providers of online marketplaces, are required to ensure that traders provide their key identification, contact, and payment details prior to making use of their services. Providers are also required to assess the completeness and accuracy of this information and must suspend service if this information isn't provided or isn't rectified where incomplete or faulty. They are also required to ensure compliance by design, as well as to provide their users with information on infringing products and services. So compliance by design, the online interface must be organized in a way that enables these third-party traders to comply with their obligations regarding pre-contractual information, compliance, and product safety. Not key in this respect. However, the right to information provision in Article 32 is of importance. This article requires providers of online marketplaces to inform the recipients of the service when they become aware that an illegal product or service has been offered on their online marketplace. They're required to outline the illegal nature of the product or service, to identify the trader, as well as to provide the recipient of the service with information on any relevant means of redress. In terms of governance and compliance, the DSA includes two key provisions, one related to independent audits. Very large online platforms and very large online search engines will be required to audit their compliance annually. This will be subject to an independent assurance provider. This article also outlines the requirements for this provider, as well as the requirements for the audit report. Finally, very large online platforms and very large online search engines will be required to establish an internal DSA compliance function. This will be an independent function that will be separate from the operational functions of the provider, but will have to have sufficient authority, stature, and resources, including the access to the management body, to monitor the compliance of the provider with the DSA. Finally, a word on implementation and enforcement. At the national level, the DSA will be enforced by national competent authorities, but all coordinated by who will be designated as the Digital Services Coordinator. These will have to be designated, as mentioned previously, by the 17th of February of next year. These Digital Services Coordinators will be equipped with relevant powers to ensure that they are able to monitor and enforce compliance. In this sense, they will have certain powers of investigation, including the power to issue requests for information, to inspect premises, as well as to take copies of information, as well as the power to take statements. In addition to these powers of investigation, digital services coordinators will also be able to accept commitments provided by providers. They will have the power to order the cessation of infringements, to impose proportionate remedies. They will have the power to impose fines and periodic penalty payments, as well as to adopt interim measures to avoid the risk of serious harm. So indeed, very important powers granted at the national level. And as we will see, also provisions on very relevant penalties to be implemented by member states. This article reads a little bit like a directive in the sense that it addresses itself to the member states. These must ensure effective, proportionate, and dissuasive penalties at the national level. The maximum amounts, as has been outlined previously, are 6% of the worldwide annual turnover for a failure to comply, 1% for a procedural infraction, and 5% of the average daily turnover as periodic penalty payment. This provision is key. Article 53 outlines the right to lodge a complaint. It states that recipients of the service, as well as any body mandated to act on their behalf, shall have the right to lodge a complaint alleging an infringement of the DSA by a provider of intermediary services with the Digital Services Coordinator of their member state. This DSC will then assess the complaint and, where appropriate, will transfer it to the DSC of establishment, meaning of where the relevant provider is established or where their legal representative is located. Both parties shall have the right to be heard during this process and receive appropriate information about the status of their complaint. A very important provision allowing us to report infringements of the Digital Services Act by providers directly to the competent authorities. With that, we've exhausted our overview of the topics under the DSA. I propose now to pass back to John to provide an overview on the tools available to tackle infringements.
Thanks very much, Jure. I think Pietro also is going to just cut the PowerPoint so we can check something. I just want to take a little step backwards as to all of that ground that we've covered. Thanks very much indeed for all of that detail, Jure. What we're talking about here within the Digital Services Act is, of course, illegal content online and what Europe is doing to tackle illegal content online. So really all of these issues that you're hearing about in terms of due diligence, transparency obligations, et cetera, all of that's really to tackle that particular area of unlicensed digital content or illegal/unlicensed content on these digital services. So that's really what this is all about. And the way I would suggest that people think about it as music publishers is really it's about structure and it's about sticks. So what the EU has done is build and boost the structure of how people report illegal or unlicensed content online, but also give a few more sticks in terms of how we enforce our rights. So I think, Pietro, have we brought the screen back up again? Colleagues can see it online? Great. Okay. So sticks and structure is about how I would summarize it. Let me just see if this will move along. Yeah, so I wanted to give just a little bit of a review or let's say a very quick summary of some of the tools in the toolbox of our industry today about what they can do about illegal content. Does the DSA change anything? As Jure says, very, very importantly, the DSA does not modify existing copyright law. Instead, it builds upon that. So that's very important to remember. What that means is, under all of the existing European legislation, all existing legal options for relief are still available to the music publishing industry operating in Europe today. So nothing changes in terms of that regard, and that's a very welcome thing. It was a touch and go in the negotiations as to whether, if and how that would change. And thankfully, that existing legal infrastructure is unchanged. That means that all existing possibilities for injunctions and damages for unlicensed content online can still be taken by the industry in any member state. And what ICMP will be pushing for in the coming years will be for cross-border recognition of those injunctions to make sure we get a single market of protection for our industry in Europe and not just a single market for access to music. So we need cross-border injunctions. We need the ability to get damages for breach and for unlicensed music. The IPR Enforcement Directive of 2004 remains a pillar of that European framework. So you've got the e-commerce directive of 2001 that Jure mentioned. You've got the copyright directive, of course, is 2001, the original copyright directive. And then you've got, sometimes that's referred to as the InfoSoc directive, I should say. Then you've got the IPR Enforcement Directive, of course, which gives some really critical, important tools for how to tackle breaches of copyright. And then we start to get into the tools of the 2019 Copyright Directive, the famous Article 17. It's very important to remember that Article 17 of the Copyright Directive applies to what we call user-uploaded content services. So particular digital platforms like YouTube, TikTok, Triller, all of these kinds of services where users can upload music onto those services. Not only are those services liable now for copyright, but the tools to tackle infringement on those services, in particular Twitter, remain the ability to notify from the industry to those platforms about the provision of illegal or unlicensed music on the services. And instead of the long-standing notice and takedown mechanisms, we of course now have notice and stay down under Article 17 for those particular types of platforms. Similarly, there is also under Article 17 the preventative blocking en masse of unlicensed music on user-uploaded content services like Twitter, etc. That was a big part of Article 17.4. So basically, if a service, this is a UEC service, which is unlicensed, publisher can now notify of the repertoire to the service, either directly or via a CMO partner, and that service must ensure preventative blocking or notice and stay down of the work or the catalogue under Article 17. And that's still very much untouched, despite a lot of political discussions in the DSA around content moderation and what not to take down from the internet and what to take down. Copyright is ring-fenced. So I think that completes our carousel of some of the tools. I wanted to take a little look. I think we've skipped back there, Pietro. We can jump to the practical implications. Yeah, we've just divided this up into not just the DSA, but really a very brief summary of the types of services, because I know many of our members, they don't think in terms of isolated pieces of legislation, say IPRED or InfoSoc or the DSA. What our members want to know is platforms. What happens when there's unlicensed music on Google, on app stores, on YouTube, etc. So of course, we will have already debriefed in detail on that. We will continue to do that as the DSA comes into force. But we will supply the table also you've seen earlier, but just to say that within search engines, of course, notice and action in terms of content moderation, as has just been laid out in detail, that applies to search. Of course, the transparency reporting to search applies as well, and transparency in how they recommend results on their services. So what that means is Google can no longer have a laissez-faire attitude and say it's not our fault if this content is appearing in our search results. It must report back to the Commission annually what it's doing about illegal or unlicensed content on its services. So again, that's the step forward the DSA provides. App stores. Now this one is a really interesting one. Camille Latorre from Warner Chappell Music has been chairing our legal expert group, and we have all together been looking in great detail about the provision of illegal and unlicensed music on the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store. I can't say too much more about that in this particular meeting for reasons of confidentiality. But basically, this is an enormous area of unlicensed and illegal music on the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store. Now, by doing that, these services are breaching exclusive rights and are infringing if they're providing illegal music. But the DSA gives the teeth on top of that of saying they must be more proactive in terms of content moderation, due diligence, transparency back to rights holders, and annually publishing reports about what's happening in terms of illegal activity on those services. Similarly, in terms of pure pirate sites, of course, the DSA applies. It's not just for big names like Google, Facebook, Meta, Twitter. This tackles all digital services to the sliding scale degree. So purely pirate sites are, of course, infringing copyrights can continue to be tackled. And indeed, all of the injunctions, IPRED and existing legal relief I mentioned are applicable to those kinds of P2P cyberlockers, BitTorrent, and all the remaining commercial scale scourges of unlicensed music that we see in today's digital marketplace. UUC platforms I've already spoken about in the context of Article 17, preventative blocking, notice and stay down, transparency, very important. That applies to these kinds of platforms. And interestingly, under the DSA, it's not just about the platforms offering the consumer content, such as YouTube and Apple App Stores, but indeed the intermediaries, such as payment services, brings in extra protections and responsibilities in that regard. So now intermediaries such as banking services, financial services, or think of a consumer-facing service like PayPal, now has not a very heavy degree of obligations, but some obligations to further scrutinize the relationships of B2B transactions. And as you can see here, the DSA guidance cites that these kinds of payment services must make tailored commitments corresponding to the diversity of services provided by these services and the roles they play, and a layer-conscious approach to content moderation. And that's legalese and Brusselese for basically saying payment services must do more to be conscious about transactions which are subsidizing, paying for, or facilitating illegal content online. And that's another very helpful tool in the DSA armory. So with that, I'm very conscious that we've covered a lot of ground. I do hope that that wasn't too dry and technical. I know in Brussels, sometimes we suffer a lot from acronyms and all of that, but we hope this has given you a good overview. Happy to answer any questions if we have any thus far. Pietro, David, Jenny, any questions at all? Perhaps if colleagues do have questions, if you simply want to unmic yourself, it's an informal meeting, and fire away, we should be able to hear you loud and clear.
Any volunteers?
Okay, if people are too shy to unmute, maybe David, do you have written questions at all we can help with?
Indeed. Sorry.
Mute. Question for Bill. Let me see. First question is, how does banning obligatory content monitoring rules being applied by member states in the DSA reconcile with the implementing local rules of the Copyright Directive in Article 17, requiring platforms to implement ACR systems to prevent infringement of content? Okay, right. So let me try and break that down. If I'm understanding correctly, Camille, you're interested in the obligations under the Copyright Directive, Article 17, requiring those platforms to implement content recognition, to preventatively block and notice and stay down content, of course, the tools that we mentioned. How does the DSA interact with that and the prevention of general monitoring? It's very important when you hear the phrase, the general monitoring obligation or the ban on general monitoring obligation, to remember two things in particular. This isn't a ban on a type of monitoring. As Jura said, it's a ban on governments in Europe implementing in their law a general monitoring of the internet obligation. So it doesn't really say about what is being monitored. It says the governments can't implement a general monitoring obligation on their internet services. So that's very important. In we see certain countries, in Hungary, where there's been very volatile government provisions brought in place. The EU has banned the ability for certain governments to allow governments to monitor the internet, essentially. That's the first thing. The second thing to remember as well too about all of this is that the DSA is, of course, a bigger beast than copyright. It's tackling disinformation, it's tackling terrorist content, it's tackling dark patterns, it's tackling all of the different electoral interference concerns that we see on Facebook, all of those kinds of big political picture issues which fall into the bucket of illegal content. That's what the DSA is designed to do in principle, to make illegal online what is illegal offline, the big picture. Within that big picture, there are specific tools which we're outlining today about what is applicable to the music industry. But when we're talking about the obligations of general monitoring, you have to bear in mind that general monitoring in a legal sense in Europe isn't just about copyright, it's about the overall internet. So basically, in short, Article 17 can fully apply, preventative blocking can fully apply, you can notify your repertoire, service doesn't have a license, must preventatively block and notice and stay down. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you, Johnny.
Thanks, Camille. We got the microphone at the end. Good to hear your voice, Camille.
I actually had a second question that I think I was next also because I was getting overexcited by everything happening. And now I've got access to my microphone. I might as well just verbalize it to you and the rest of the group. But it was under the Article 40 of the DSA and the very large online platform obligations around providing data. Do you think that there might be a route somehow to use those obligations to ultimately require very large online platforms to provide a minimum standard of music usage data that could be used by publishers and CMOs?
So if I understand correctly, are you referring to the reporting obligations from the platforms back to the Commission or the platforms back to rights holders?
Well, I'm asking about for the platforms to just the way it was described around the obligations around providing data and then implementing systems better for that. If we think there is a route that could be developed to provide minimum standards of data in respect of music usage for rights holders.
Yeah, indeed, good question. I'll answer that in a couple of ways and we'll follow up in more detail after this. First of all, the reporting obligations principally in the DSA are mostly around content moderation, how platforms are taking steps to tackle illegal or unlicensed music online. And mostly what's happening, and this is what I mean by structure, that's happening at national level with the digital service coordinators in each member state. That's a new structure which all of our MPAs can use. So the reporting is going that way from the platforms into the DSCs. But the platforms are also having and are obliged to report about what they're doing about illegal content into the Commission. So DG Connect, for the first time ever, has a kind of enforcement aspect of this in the copyright unit. So that information is going from the platforms on an annual basis back into them. how we can leverage, well, one thing I'll say about that also is the commercial agreements, of course, with music publishers to platforms, but also to CMOs would be fully safeguarded by all of the commercial confidentiality that those agreements would have in place. So there's no risk about those reporting obligations. Disclosing any information from music publishers wouldn't want the national structures or indeed the commission to see. So that is safeguarded. And how we can leverage those obligations in terms of getting platforms to report back to rights holders, I would point to the fact that simply, yes, there will be obligations to report back the illegal activity on these services. And if we take a platform like Twitter, that's a big deal. Perhaps,
Absolutely.
you want to say anything further about that?
Yeah, I have the Article 40. Hi, hello again. And thank you, Camille, for your question. I have Article 40 open here, and indeed, it requires providers of very large online platforms, very large online search engines to provide the digital services coordinators or the commission with information following a reasonable period following that request. But that is data that's necessary to monitor and assess compliance with the regulation. Now, if we were able to spin it that way to show that music usage information would be required to show compliance with the Digital Services Act, then indeed that information could be part of that reporting. But also what I'd like to point to under Article 40 is the status of vetted researchers who may, once granted that status, may submit their application for access. And when they're awarded this status, they can request very large online platforms and very large online search engines to grant them access to certain types of information, possibly also including some music usage reports. Something that we will follow, certainly a very relevant question, but there might be a way to ensure that information is reported through Article 40. More to follow.
Thank you.
Thanks, Camille. Any others? You still excited about that? Can we help with anything else? Any other issues or topics we could go on?
Those are my questions, but I know there was more written down in the chat. So
Okay, super. I can't see that, so I'm just relying upon others. Thanks so much, Camille. I think we have Ricardo with their hand up here. Ricardo, how are you doing?
Hi, John. Good afternoon to everyone. First of all, congratulate you and your team, John, for the great work you've done with this presentation. I really don't have one question, but I have a kind of an heads up, and I don't want to talk about a lot that has been done, but especially something that still needs to be done, which is about the Digital Services Coordinator, which is now the upcoming months are absolutely critical because you do have different realities in the different member states, right? And you have some member states where the Digital Services Coordinator can be an audiovisual entity, in others can be the telecom, some others going to be new and something that's going to be created from scratch. Mm-hmm. So from a copyright perspective, from a rights holder perspective, from our industry sector perspective, there are some risks because if you have an entity that is not used to deal with copyright, that is not really keen to understand very specifics of our activities, of course, it poses additional risk. So it is a kind of a heads up for the next months are really very, very important for some work to be done in the different capitals in order to try to influence for having a digital services coordinator that has, of course, skills, competences, resources, and keen to understand really the specifics of the industry which we represent, the music sector. Thank you, John.
You know, that's really great, Ricardo. A super important point. I think that really actually it really aids the fact that ICMP is restructured into our regional groups now with the MPAs heading up in each country. We need to be very closely coordinated in that regard. I can't say too much on this call with guests, but indeed it would emphasize the importance of our upcoming meeting in March in Brussels to get everyone together, because in a practical term, we need to, as Ricardo says, analyze who's going to be that DSE in each member state, but then also importantly, how will we report into them about unlicensed music, and how will we make sure that we're tackling the problems of piracy effectively under the DSA. So onwards to March. I think the dates, if I'm not mistaken, Jenny, is the 29th we're looking at, and I would encourage everyone to show up so we can really have a good rake over the coals on this issue. All parts of the structure that we can report in. One last point I would just mention also is that I know we've covered a lot of ground here. This might appear very technical to a lot of people in licensing divisions in A&R, etc. a big thing about the DSA is that ICMP now, which we liaise with the Commission and the Council of the Parliament all the time, but now we have new structures to formally report back problems our members are seeing. Companies of any size, MPAs of any size, report our problems to us, and we can take care of the rest in terms of channeling those issues and complaints into the Commission under the new structures. So that's very much our job to lift that weight for you. Anyone else in terms of questions? Don't be shy. With that, any questions? Anyone want to unmute? Oh, I think we have hands. Okay, Antal, I can see you, so I'm picking you, Antal. How are you doing?
Will it be if I realize a copyright infringement, what can I do? So this Digital Copyright Act will be implemented in the local legislation or not?
So as you mentioned, Antal, the key thing to remember about the DSA in terms of the type of law is it's a regulation, not a directive. As you know, the copyright is a copyright directive, therefore it needs to be transposed in 27 member states. A regulation does not. A regulation is directly applicable. So there's no work to be done in Hungary, in France, in Sweden, in Romania, in Spain, in terms of implementing that in national law. It directly goes into national law. And David has already shared the text of the regulation in the chat box. We'll also share the link again to the overall legislation in various European languages, but that is now a matter of national law. So it's transposed, so to speak, already. What do you need to do in terms of copyright infringement? Well, a lot can be done already under the pieces of legislation I've already mentioned. Again, the digital marketplace in Europe is mostly licensed, but for those services which are not licensed, either CMO partners or companies themselves can now notify under Article 17 if it's Twitter, or if it's a broader range of digital services not falling under Article 17, they can now notify under the DSA as of the end of February about the things that they need to do to be duly diligent, to be transparent about what those platforms are doing to tackle unlicensed music on their services. So think about that in terms of an example. The app stores work that we're doing, which clarifies the scale of the problem of piracy on app stores. Under the DSA, we can now tackle the biggest app store providers in the world with the new responsibilities that they must be doing to tackle infringing content online, whether it's sheet music or BTS on an app.
Thank you.
Thank you, Antal. Nice to see you. Anyone else?
Hello.
Hi, Roland.
Hi, this is Roland. Thank you, Johnny, for this fantastic presentation. Only one practical question. It was a fantastic and really easy to follow presentation. Is it possible to have it only for in-house usage to show to colleagues who couldn't attend? Is it possible to have this presentation somehow, because it was really, really useful, and I think it has to be propagate in our organization as well. So is it possible to have it somehow on the PPT or something that you create, or all the recording you made?
Yeah, indeed. And thank you very much, Roland. I just want to emphasize the enormous amount of work which has gone in by David and Pietro and Jenny and Yura into this. So they've really done a great job in terms of making this
absolutely
clear.
Absolutely.
So thank you to all the team for doing that. In terms of the presentation itself, this is a condensed or concise version of our detailed legal briefings. We're guarding those very closely, frankly, because this is privileged information for ICMP members. What I would suggest is the best thing you can do is come to Brussels in March, and we'll have a full package. Not that I'm trying to pry tourist guide, but frankly, the law will be in place as of February. We do need to have an even more confidential discussion about how we as an industry play into the Commission, into the Council, and so on. So we will be circulating some materials to a closed list of ICMP members, indeed, Roland, and more news soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else?
Johnny?
Hi, Nicolas. Bonjour.
Hi everyone, and thank you for this great presentation. Just a quick question. Is there any review clause de revoyure, that may have an impact on the DSA in the future, in the near future or in the long run?
In terms of in terms of a sunset clause, no, this is now directly applicable and is the law of the land. It, as you mentioned, will be phased. So depending on the type of platform, the obligations kick in phases over the next year or so. Basically by February next year, the full shebang will be in place. And in terms of reviews, it's more applicable to specific provisions in terms of how the platforms are moderating their content online. So that has a review mechanism. But as in terms of the whole legislation, I don't think they will be scrutinized. Maybe I'll pass to you to see if they're going to review the whole legislation.
Hi, Nicola. Thank you very much for that very relevant question indeed. There are a couple of points where the Commission will be required to evaluate and report to the legislators as well as to other entities on, for instance, the impact of these new rules on the growth of small and medium enterprises. This report will be prepared by the 18th of February, 2027. By the 17th of November, 2025, the Commission will report to the Parliament, the Council, and the Economic and Social Committee on a number of provisions. And as well, in the same vein, by the 17th of November 2027, in every 5 years thereafter, the Commission will evaluate the regulation and report to the co-legislators, as well as to the European Economic and Social Committee. It isn't clear whether there will be any review that is mandated by this legislation, but certainly reports evaluating its implementation and action will be provided by the Commission.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything else we might be able to help you with at this time?
Anyone else, folks? Oh, I see one written question here do you have to be based in the EU in order to be a trusted flagger? Easiest answer for that is ICMP is based in the EU and we'll do the heavy lifting for you. So if you have any problems, whether you're based in New York or in the UK or in Japan, we will now have the ability to, well, even more reporting back into the Commission about how this works. So report to us and we'll carry that message. Okay, any last questions? We'll give it 5 seconds if anyone's. Okay, well, I hope that wasn't too technical for a late afternoon or early morning. I see Rail there on the call as well too. Great to see you. Great to see some colleagues from Turkey and Asia as well too. Again, my thanks to the team for putting this together. We'll circulate the materials and yeah, great to see you all. We'll discuss this more soon and yeah, hoping to see you in Brussels in March, if not before. And my thanks and upwards and onwards for the DSA. Thanks, everyone. All the best and bye for now.
Thank you.
See you. Bye.
Cheerio, guys.
Bye.